Thank you very much for the opportunity. To speak today, and thank you for organizing this event. So what I'm going to be talking about today is Taiwanese perspectives on Russia's war in Ukraine. This is the result of a project that I did for the Navy about a year ago. Went to Taiwan and did a lot of interviews with foreign policy experts there at various universities and government-linked think tanks. However, I should say, this is not the official view of the Department of Defense. I'm required to say this. So this is not the official view of the Department of Defense on any of these issues. All right, so just a little bit of background here. So the U.S.'s war in Ukraine has heightened concerns about a PRC attack. This has made it so that before, people, when they talked about Taiwan, they thought maybe someday there would be an attack on Taiwan. But since the Ukraine war, it's become an issue that people think this might happen soon. In the United States, there's become this focus on the year 2027 because Xi Jinping supposedly said that they had to be ready for war by 2027. And so there's been a lot more discussion of what it is that actually going to happen, and is Beijing looking at Taiwan and thinking, okay, this is like Ukraine, we should do something similar to that with Taiwan. So a lot of this discussion that I've noticed has focused on Chinese perspectives on this issue. So what do the Chinese think about the war? What are they learning from it? And then also American perspectives. What does it mean for the U.S.? What does it mean for its commitments in Asia? What does it mean for its commitments to Taiwan? How should the U.S. respond? How should the U.S. prepare for a potential conflict in Taiwan? But there's been a lot less trying to understand what Taiwanese actually think about this issue. There's been some research on this. I'm not the only person doing this, but there's definitely significantly less on that than American and Chinese perspectives, at least in the American context. I don't know the European context as well in terms of research. I did interviews last summer with a whole bunch of Taiwanese experts, and then just to give you a little bit of overview of what we'll be talking about is just I looked at sort of lessons learned. What were Taiwanese trying to learn from the war in terms of their military strategy especially? How has it changed their international environment? How has Taiwan's relationships with Europe and others changed since the war? And then also, what do people in Taiwan think about a war with China? How have public views changed, and what are they doing? So a few different things about what it's learned from the war. First off is there was a pre-existing shift away from conventional warfare towards asymmetric warfare. So this is something that's been confirmed as the right path by the war and the way that Ukraine has fought against Russia. Most people in Taiwan see this as validating this pre-existing shift away from conventional warfare to asymmetric warfare. There are some people who disagree with them, and there's some efforts to try to continue, especially to have a sub in Taiwan and other sort of bigger hardware. There's some people who still want this, but overall there's a much bigger shift towards what people sometimes call porcupine strategy, or just an asymmetric warfare strategy. So what does this mean? So one thing is stressing concealment, so hiding all of their military assets, redundancy, so having a whole bunch of different places that have the exact same thing, so that if one of them gets destroyed, they're able to move to somewhere else. And then also a decentralized command structure. So there's been concerns about some sort of decapitation strike in Taipei. And so before, there was certain places that we knew that the Taiwanese leadership was most likely to go to, but now they've made it so it's much more of a decentralized command structure, so that even if the central government gets decapitated, they'll be able to operate much more independently on the local level. Other thing is just in terms of military hardware. So what they've emphasized is acquiring a lot of small things. So these are things like that you've seen in Ukraine. So these are small portable missiles or small arms. Just any sort of thing that they can move around is going to be cheap, and they can produce lots of them. And sort of the strategy here is just to make it so that it would be hard for the PLA to take out all of the assets. It's not like they could just bomb all of the F-16s that Taiwan has and then the war is over. If they've got a lot of different little weapons that they can move all over the place, it'll be hard for them to attack them. There's definitely also been a lot of trying to learn from what Ukraine has done in terms of the war effort. So bringing in more missiles, bringing in more portable missiles, bringing in more unmanned vehicles, bringing in more drones. These are all sorts of things that Taiwan has emphasized, so that it makes it so that the PRC forces can't defeat Taiwan quickly, that Taiwan could carry out an insurgency or carry out a resistance against China, even if they were able to land on the island. Also, just in terms of exercises have changed in the way that Taiwan does them. Before, there were much more big conventional exercises. Now there's a lot more emphasis on commando operations or special forces type operations. And there is some indication from in the open source materials that the U.S. Marines and other people are in Taiwan assisting with training in these sort of scenarios, probably coming from things that they learned in the wars of the Middle East. Last piece here is just there's been an effort that would have been really largely unimaginable a few decades ago in Taiwan, is to strengthen the defense base within Taiwan. So making it so that Taiwan has the ability to produce stuff and doesn't have to wait for the U.S. to just provide it to them, that they can produce these small arms so that some of these things that I talked about before, so that they can make them all on their own, in the hopes that eventually the U.S. will come in, but until the U.S. comes in, they're able to survive on their own. All right, another big thing that people emphasize in my interviews with them is Taiwan is very different than Ukraine. So some of the things I'm just going to say now are probably things that, if those of you who know this issue are already aware of. One is, repeatedly, the people I talked to said, Ukraine doesn't really matter that much for international trade. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was the Taiwanese impression, that Ukraine doesn't really matter for international trade, while Taiwan is central to global trade. And the Taiwan Strait, there is tons of trade flowing back and forth between here that makes it much more essential for the global economy, and the way that Ukraine just isn't. Also, it makes it so that you can blockade Taiwan. Unless Russia occupies Poland, before the United States decided to not send weapons to Ukraine anymore, but before that, you could send weapons through Poland and continue to do this, because you couldn't blockade Poland really, so unless you occupied it. So there was a hope also amongst Taiwanese that there would be some sort of minor involvement of the United States. So the hope was that even if there was an effort to blockade the island, which the PLA has showed they have the ability to do, at least in theory, with recent exercises over the last few years, there was hopes that, probably especially coming from this area, or meaning up towards Japan or down here towards the Philippines, that the U.S. would keep open some sea lines of communication, so that they would send in some assets, and then it might not, hopefully would not lead to conflict with, actually the Taiwanese might actually hope there's conflict, but it would make it so that you could still get materials into Taiwan, even if the PLA decided to try to blockade the island. There's big concerns, though, about if there was a blockade, if the Taiwanese public would actually last, if they would just give up. Amongst a number of people, they talked about how young people, especially, they thought would just sort of roll over and wouldn't have the stamina, wouldn't have the wherewithal to go through hardship. So one thing that we've seen is there's been efforts to stockpile supplies, and one of the reasons for this is because they know and they expect that it would take at least 2 weeks to a month for the U.S. to become involved in the war, because the U.S. is, at least in their perception, wouldn't likely to join quickly, because you'd have to have negotiations, you'd have to have discussions in the United States. The Congress would have to go through various levels of approvals before the war actually got the U.S. involved, because it would be such a big commitment. And so there's been efforts to stockpile supplies as a way to sort of deal with this domestic morale problem, but also in hopes that the U.S. eventually comes in. The Taiwanese overall were didn't think sanctions really had worked. They thought that sanctions towards Russia were ineffective, and that it wasn't going to be something that was able to prevent a war. It wasn't, some people, when the sanctions started on Ukraine, thought, look, the sanctions are so robust, it's hobbling Russia, and therefore, China wouldn't go to war over Taiwan. At least in my experience talking to Taiwanese, most people didn't think this was true. Most of the people thought that the sanctions really hadn't led to much, even though there were some people talking about how they thought that China was a little bit more vulnerable because it's much more embedded and connected with international markets than Ukraine is. Still, they didn't think they would really amount to much in the end. Also, they tended to think that Xi Jinping is not like Vladimir Putin, that Xi Jinping is much more risk adverse. China has lots of domestic problems, and so that it was unlikely that they would take this big risk of going to war over Taiwan, because things could go badly very easily, and then it would threaten the legitimacy of the party. And so that it was unlikely, a number of my interlocutors said that they would actually go to war because just Xi Jinping is much less risk averse, much less aggressive than Vladimir Putin is. So what have Taiwanese had to say about the impact on Taiwan's foreign relations? So for any of you who have interacted with Taiwanese, you're probably very aware of this point. The Taiwanese have been worried for a very long time, pretty much since the 70s, about how their when they lost recognition in the UN of, and also recognition by the United States, of just their diplomatic space shrinking. And these concerns have gotten even stronger in the last few years. So, but with the Ukraine war, there's definitely been a sense amongst Taiwanese that people talk more about them. People are more concerned about them. Europeans are willing to make more statements about them. Europeans are willing to say more things, not defense and security commitments, but at least making more statements that they would prefer to have some sort of peaceful resolution. The same thing with the United States, and then also Japan and the Philippines, especially, are sort of places that say a little bit more in terms of support for them since the Ukraine war. So most of the people I talked about thought that U.S. support was solid. I don't know if I agree with them. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But a lot of people, I was surprised, thought that strategic ambiguity was bad. When I think about it now, I'm less surprised, but they thought that the strategic ambiguity of the U.S., meaning we aren't sure if we're going to actually intervene in any sort of military conflict or not, they thought that that was bad and that we should move instead towards a policy of strategic clarity because this would give them more robust economic ties and more military security with the United States. So there's a notable people on the outside of the main party now. So the DPP is the ruling party in Taiwan now, but there's a noticeable people amongst the KMT especially who do worry about the abandonment discourse, that the U.S. could decide to just abandon Taiwan. A lot of people point to Afghanistan as a case of this, that the U.S. just left and then they were left on their own and they had to deal with their own problems. And so these people tend to say that what should Taiwan do instead? They should try to improve the economic relationship with China. They should try to get better economic ties. They should try to have more visits and more cross-strait connections. We can talk a little bit whether this is going to become more dominant or not in the Q&A if you'd like. In terms of who they see as most reliable beyond the United States, it's definitely Japan. Japan, unsurprisingly, that's who the Taiwanese trust the most. The Philippines, which is a bit different because in the Philippines, I think most people in Taiwan have a fairly negative view of the Philippines. But in terms of security partnerships, they've become aware over the last few years of how much the Philippines would potentially be involved in any sort of military scenario. Australia as well with AUKUS, even though we've seen, I don't know if you noticed in the last few days, there's been some discussions about how AUKUS is bad and the U.S. should maybe step out of it. But at least last year, they thought that the subs would be important and other sort of Australian connections with the U.S. military would be important in any sort of military conflict, at least for bases and logistics, not necessarily their forces getting involved, but as a way station for American troops. However, the Taiwanese were pretty realistic overall, and that they thought that even though there's much more concern about Taiwan, even though there's much more statements in support of Taiwan, even though there's more people from, Europeans are going to Taiwan and visiting there and making these statements in support of them, this would have been unimaginable a few years ago. This has become somewhat normalized now, even though it seems to have died down a little bit under Trump 2.0. I think that's partially because everybody's in a holding pattern to see what Trump does with China. But there is a concern definitely amongst the Taiwanese that in any sort of conflict scenario, people are going to prioritize their national interests. They're not going to just do this out of the goodness of their heart. They might do it for economic reasons, getting involved in military conflict or putting economic pressure on Taiwan. But they're not going to just protect Taiwan to be nice people or something. They're going to do it out of self-interest for their nation. All right, so a little bit more on the impact on Taiwan's foreign relations. So most people thought beyond Japan and the Philippines and Australia, they didn't think any other Asian state would really help them that much. They didn't think that in a conflict they would come to their aid in any way. Taiwan doesn't have strong ties with South Korea. If you've been to Taiwan, you probably have noticed that there's sort of tense relations with South Korea. And then I also didn't think that they would get involved, similar to what American analysts have said, because South Korea could be constrained by North Korea. If there was a conflict, then China could possibly get North Korea to do something on the border as a way to keep American troops pinned down in South Korea. They did think that they could be useful, though, as logistic hubs. They also could be useful in that it could be a way, if you look at it from a different perspective, to tie down Chinese forces, that you have India do some sort of conflict on the border with China, and this would be a way of diverting or just keeping Chinese forces having to stay there rather than moving all the assets towards the Western Pacific. The rest of Southeast Asia, they thought, was unlikely to really help Taiwan in any significant way because of just the strong economic ties to China, where China, if you look at graphs and charts and everything, China has really become the center of trade for East Asia, and so most people thought that that Southeast Asian countries would prioritize their ties to China instead. Singapore was a little bit different in that they thought it would be involved as a logistics place. That since the U.S. does have a military presence there, they thought logistically it might be important. So as for Europeans, the general consensus amongst the people I talked to was that, as I was saying before, Europeans have become more concerned about the PRC. This has happened before the Ukraine war, but even though the war has amplified the concerns, they didn't really think that Europe was likely to do any sort of robust military support for Taiwan. I don't know if that view would change now that Europe supposedly is going to build a military. We'll see if that actually happens. But now that Europe is going to supposedly build a military, maybe their view will change. I'm supposed to go to Taiwan later this year, and so I'll see if people's views on this have changed. But before, they thought they didn't really think of Europe as a military power, so they explicitly said that Europe doesn't have any military, and so they're not going to be able to do much for us. And then any sort of forces the Europe did have was going to have to be focused on Ukraine, or focused on the Russian threat. Also, they thought that the European worldview was different than the United States. So they think of the U.S. as a place that's a hegemon, is dominant, and is very concerned about any sort of threats to its dominance, while Europe has much more propensity to be supportive of a multipolar world, which is what China talks about all the time, is that we're into this new multipolar world with Europe, China, the United States, and other actors as well. While in the United States, this is something that's not very popular, but the Taiwanese thought this was a view that was also supported by Europeans. All right, so just to finish up here, a little bit about what do Taiwanese think about supporting their country in terms of an actual conflict, and what is Taiwan doing to actually prepare itself domestically and mobilize the population for war. So one is, before, for most people in Taiwan, the war with China was something very abstract. It was something that they couldn't really imagine. It was something that just seemed like, okay, we talk about this all the time, but it wasn't anything that they could really see what it would possibly look like. But with the Ukraine war, it became something that they could see all the time on TV, and they could see images of it on TV or on the social media. And so they were aware of what a war would possibly look like, and also a war that seemed kind of similar in terms of they would have to fight asymmetric warfare against this much stronger adversary. And so they were able to see what this possibly might look like, and it just made it so more people are aware. Doesn't mean that everybody's up in arms and ready to fight all of a sudden, but it definitely made it more palpable, so it was more something that they could really see what the impact would be on their daily lives if there was a war over Taiwan. If you look at surveys, and these were numbers that were repeatedly cited to me by people I talk with in Taiwan, 70% of the public declares that it's willing to fight for Taiwan. The reason that a lot of people cited for this is because Taiwanese, over the last few decades especially, have come to think that their homeland is not China. Their homeland is the island, their homeland is Taiwan, and they want to defend it. And they don't, and this is something that's very, this isn't something that necessarily the people I interviewed talked about, but this has really been taught in schools. This is something that's become part of popular culture, just pride in being Taiwanese and identifying with Taiwan, and not even talking about China sometimes. It's like China's not even there. It's kind of like the US and Canada, or the US and Mexico. These countries don't really seem to exist, even though they're right across the border. They're not something that shows up in public education really at all. So in terms of support for engaging in combat against China, there's strong backing across the political spectrum. So these numbers of 70%, if you look at surveys that actually break down by age and by party affiliation, it's pretty strong across the board. It's not just like only DPP supporters are supportive of it, but it's definitely higher amongst the DPP than KMT. Also, the other thing we see that older people who are not likely to be too involved in fighting, except maybe in some auxiliary role, are much more willing to support fighting than younger people. So people who are of combat age, there's less support amongst them, but I don't want to stress this point too much because it's still like 60%. So it goes down from like 90% for older people, but it's still about 60% for people who are in their 20s, which would be the people who would really have to risk their lives in the case of a conflict. So there has been some resistance amongst youth, though. So recently, the Taiwanese government has made it so that military service is become longer, and because they see this is necessary if it's going to actually have an effect on preparations for war, you need to have longer service. And so some people have pushed back against this and seen it as, I would rather focus on my career, I'd rather focus on my education than put all this efforts into the military service. All right. However, there is still a lot of people that see military service as a patriotic duty, and I think this goes back to just what I was talking about before, and that there's broad support amongst the Taiwanese public of this is our homeland, we must defend it against invaders or against occupiers, against outside forces, which is the way that China is seen these days in Taiwan. So some of these people, some of the youth groups, and I talked with some of these people, have actually formed their own civil defense groups. So there's the Kuma Academy, there's a couple other groups that have formed in Taiwan. Some of these people actually, interestingly, came out of the Sunflower Movement. If you remember that, that was the group a few years ago that occupied the parliament, the legislature, because they were pushing back against moves to have stronger economic ties with China. Some of those people, a lot of those people have gone into government. Some of them have gone into this sort of more civil defense stuff and preparing the public for fighting a war. Why do they do this? What are the motivations for people? So a lot of it is just Taiwanese national identity, Taiwanese national sovereignty. And then a big part of it is, I think, that in Taiwan, there is nationalism is a democratic nationalism, and that what they want to defend is democracy. There's a very strong distinction between we are democratic, China is authoritarian, we do not want to have an authoritarian government, and this sort of thinking has become even stronger after Hong Kong has turned into a more authoritarian place than it was before the national security law. All right, so what have they focused on in terms of their preparations for war? Some of it is just logistics, is making it so that if there was a war, there would be logistic networks that were set up so people wouldn't just run out of supplies for food, run out of medical supplies. Also training people in basic military skills. There's definitely concern in amongst the DPP, amongst the Taiwanese government, that the PRC is trying to create a shadow government. And what I mean by this is there's concerns that the United Front Department and other organizations are trying to influence Taiwanese people and make it so that they'll be either willing to just sort of give up a war effort, or there will be groups who are economic elites, who are cultural elites, who are maybe with even political elites, who are, if there was an invasion, they could quickly transition into becoming collaborators, basically, that they would help with the new government. And so there's definitely concerns about this. And if you've been following Taiwanese news recently, there's actually efforts to remove some people from the legislature because there's concerns that they have too strong ties to the PRC. And this is part of this just broader concern that what I see they're concerned about is Taiwan becoming like Hong Kong, where you have a lot of local elites that are tied to China, and because of their ties to China, they were much more amenable to the transition towards authoritarianism in Hong Kong, and Taiwanese do not want to see this happen in Taiwan. Other thing that they've done is the government has done is just increasing the defense budget. Definitely not as much as the United States has proposed that they increase the defense budget, but definitely increasing it more than before. And then also there's been efforts to try to make the military a positive in Taiwan. And this is a big shift than what we'd seen a few years ago, where before the DPP had a very adversarial relationship with the military, and this grew out of the authoritarian period where the military was something that oppressed the DPP. But now there's much more of an effort by the DPP to make it so that military service is seen as a patriotic duty. Having this military mindset of wanting to defend the country is something that's positive, and there's been all these sort of efforts and campaigns by the DPP to promote this amongst the broader public. Question of how successful this is, but if you look at surveys, a lot of people are supportive of the idea of going to war with China, or I should probably say not going to war with China, but defending against a Chinese invasion. All right, so that's all that I've got. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to talk about any sort of questions that you guys have.